Welcome everyone to our latest edition of The Life Academic. Today I am delighted to welcome Dr. Craig Harper. Now Craig is an Associate Professor in Psychology and also the co-creator of the iProgress community, a coaching and consultancy community for students. Now, their objective is looking to support students in both the productivity, but I think even more importantly, in their enjoyment of their academic journeys themselves. So you're very welcome, Craig.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
So my first question is, please would you tell us about yourself from an academic perspective, so your academic journey?
Oh God, well, my journey is fairly standard, I guess. I did my undergraduate degree in psychology with clinical psychology. I really enjoyed different parts of that course, particularly around research methods, to be honest. I'm one of the kind of rare breeds, I think, that enjoy research methods and research type stuff.
Yeah.
That then led me to a final year project where I was looking at attitudes towards people who commit sexual offences. So as will probably become clear, my background in research is typically around forensic psychology and social attitudes towards crime, typically. So I started that in my undergraduate degree. And then from there just kind of went into a master's degree, so forensic psychology master's degree. Following that, carried on doing similar kind of research, looking at social responses to sexual crime. And then that led to my PhD. So all of those were at the same institution with the same supervisor, basically one long project that eventually took about, well, from the undergraduate to the end of the PhD, that would have been about 6 years in all.
Wow.
Kind of doing that one big piece of work, I guess, but broken down into mini projects. So yeah, that was my academic journey. In between, I've done kind of various different jobs. So my master's I did part-time whilst I was working in the NHS. So I was doing audit and research work in the NHS whilst I was doing that, just to earn some money, really. But that was really good in terms of giving me on the ground kind of knowledge and training about what it actually means to be a researcher day to day. What that looks like when you're trying to translate findings into practice, when you're trying to evaluate services. And that's something that's kind of slowly kind of creeping into my research agenda as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And we'll come back and touch on that, I think. So with regard to choosing psychology then, was that something you just knew right from the beginning when you're at, you know, I can imagine you're at school, you're sort of always interested in people's motivations, why they did what they did, and just thought, you know what, I know exactly what I'm going to do?
Do you know what? I was actually having a conversation with a couple of members of my family this weekend, just gone, about all of the different ideas of degrees that I was going to do when I was growing up. So I was one of these kids who no one in my family had really gone to university. I'm the first person in my immediate family to have gone to university. Second person in my extended family. I had one older cousin that went to do psychology as well, actually, at university. But I remember going to my uncle and my auntie's house at the weekends and kind of having a different idea every month about what I was going to do. So at one point I was going to do business studies, at one point I was going to do law, at one point I was going to do media studies, and then I settled on psychology. I think it was to do with my A levels. So I did a psychology A level when I was at school, and my psychology teacher was really passionate about the topic, and it's just something that stuck at that point. And that's why I think it's really important, and something that I really try and do is to teach with passion and to have this kind of real desire to kind of spark that interest in students, because it definitely worked for me. I think the one thing that's really interesting though is that if you look at all of those different parts, all of those different potential courses, so law, media, psychology, and then you look at what I do now, it's all around media representations of crime, and how that leads to different psychological outcomes in terms of attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. So all of those things have come together eventually. But no, it wasn't automatically something that I knew I wanted to do from an early age. It was just something that I kind of fell into through my studies.
No, that is interesting. I love that idea. You're right. You were circling all the same kind of idea, just looking at it from, outcome perspective, law, from input perspective, media, to now the sort of underlying rationales and reasons why people would adopt those attitudes. It's very interesting. And yeah, I think I share some of your fascination, and so I absolutely get it and empathise. And I suppose let's sort of touch upon, the areas of psychology that interest you most. So you've certainly talked about attitudes towards social behaviours and maybe antisocial behaviours and that kind of thing. What sort of, is that the thing that sort of really piqued your interest early on? Why people did what they did?
Yeah, I guess so. I think any psychology undergraduate has this kind of fascination about why people behave in different ways. I think that seems to be the reason when you ask a psychology undergraduate, why are you doing this course? That seems to be the thing that comes through, either that or I want to help people. So I think people are going through the process of thinking about clinical psychology. Yeah. They'll have this kind of mindset of, I want to make a difference, so I want to help people. Yeah. For me, I don't want to sound heartless, that wasn't necessarily the motivation. I was just interested in why people do what they do. But over time, I think my interest has developed a little bit, and I find myself looking at different topics that are socially debated, socially controversial. So if you look at the research that I've been doing recently, it's all about either responses to people who have sexual interest in children, what we can do to maybe support them to live crime-free lives. Ultimately to protect children from harm. Recently, I've been moving into on a similar topic, looking at why people own things like sex dolls and whether or not that's associated with risk and well-being and things like that. But I do a lot of stuff that isn't forensic as well. So I do kind of political decision making, which obviously is difficult as well, controversial stuff. So things like the idea, I don't know if you're aware of the concept of microaggressions at all.
Yes, absolutely.
So I've been doing some work on microaggressions, looking at whether or not this is just an ideological label, basically. And it seems as though that might be the case. We can see that people are labeling things as being microaggressive based on who is being targeted by that particular behaviour. And there's an interaction with the perceiver's ideology as well. So yeah, I seem to have just fallen into a habit, I guess, but a habit that I quite like, of just exploring difficult conversations, difficult topics, particularly if there's no data about that topic. So I recently did a podcast, and maybe we can share this with your viewers as well, on the psychology of sex doll ownership. And as part of that, I was asked, so why are you interested in this topic? And that's a question I get all the time. And the answer to that really is that we've got people making these really big claims about criminalization and risk and things like that. And there's literally no data to support any of it. It could be that they're right and there's no data yet to support that view. It could be that they're completely wrong, and we're potentially going to be banning articles that people actually get enjoyment out of and actually fulfillment in their lives, or even could be something that prevents harm at the most extreme edge of that. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And if we're doing that on the basis of the fact that we just find them a little bit icky, then I don't think that's a good grounding for public policy, to be honest. So I think my interest really is in social discussions that are almost entirely lacking in data, and trying to provide some data for that, to have more empirically based, more evidence-based discussions.
I think I just written down, you're like a psychological explorer. You're looking at the edges of what we know and what we've investigated, and trying to sort of expand that knowledge base. So in a way, it's sort of like it's exciting, and it's sort of like first ground stepped, and I can see why that would be so fascinating. And also, I mean, I just want to challenge a little bit. You said that you almost dichotomized. You said people either went into psychology to help or to find out how people tick. But actually, if you look at it, it's almost, they're absolutely two sides of the same coin in a way, because understanding how people tick can lead you to how to help. And even when you're talking about your investigation into the use of sex dolls, there you go. You've got that sort of trying to understand why, but yet with an ultimate objective of helping and supporting and defining, well, if this is negative behavior, then of course we need to support people away from it. But if it's actually positive behavior, then we need to find a way of allowing it within certain bounds, I would guess, or at least finding where those bounds are. So no, I think it's very interesting. And the final thing I'll say on this, and this is personal to me, is we need to have a discussion on microaggressions, because that is very, very pertinent to my own research. But I'm not going to do that today. Okay, so I want you to sort of take a moment to reflect, if you don't mind, and we're going to come back to your research, but I want you to sort of look back before we look forward. So what for you is your proudest moment in your academic career so far?
God, it's a really good question. There's a few times I felt really proud. There's not that many that really stand out. I think the first one, the earliest one, was probably graduating from my master's. So it's interesting that it wasn't my undergraduate degree. It wasn't the first graduation. It was the master's degree. And I think part of the reason for that is that we see so many people go to university these days that, I don't know, it felt like when I graduated my undergraduate degree, it felt like that was essentially an extension of getting your A-level results, and that was just the next thing that you do. Whereas the master's degree felt like a proper degree, and I don't mean that in terms of disparaging anyone who's got an undergraduate degree at all, because getting a degree is really difficult, and we talk about that on our podcast as well, the iProgress podcast. But it felt to me, because there wasn't that big, so I was in a cohort of about 200 students, so there weren't that many students around me in my master's. That was a group of maybe 20 or 30. So it felt a little bit more exclusive in that sense. The second time that I felt pride was at the end of my PhD, going into a lectureship. So it wasn't necessarily finishing the PhD, it was the getting the lectureship straight off the back of it. Because there were a few things that happened during my PhD that were really difficult, really trying times. And there were times during that PhD where I thought, do you know what, this just isn't worth it. And I think a lot of PhD students probably get that around so I got it around the second year, and apparently that's quite common. So the full-time students, second year, part-time students, years 3 to 4 maybe. When you get to a point where you're kind of established in that PhD role, but you're not really sure where it's going to take you. So yeah, I'm kind of pushing through that, going through different things during that time, and then coming out the other side with a PhD, with some publications, with a job. I think, yeah, actually, that probably is the proudest I've felt during my career.
No, that's really interesting. I think I agree with you. I absolutely understand what you're saying. This is remembering a long way back for me, but when I did my undergraduate degree, it almost wasn't my purpose. My purpose was, not to have fun, but I did. But almost, I was always looking at what was I going to be doing after the degree rather than the degree itself. But when you do a master's, you're very much choosing that as a sort of real option, and that is, as a result, that much more meaningful. So I can understand why that resonated a little bit more strongly when you achieved that goal. And as you say, the cohort shrinks as well, so there are less people around you. And I think the second thing that I'd like to draw out would be, yeah, I get it, because you've done the PhD, but it's more about, oh my goodness, here I am, I'm established now, and this is what I do. And yeah, I can see why that would generate such a sense of pride. So no, very good. Thank you for sharing. Okay, I'm going to move on, and let's focus on your research and your current research at the moment. So tell us about what you're doing, what's really exciting you, what you're sort of waking up and thinking, oh gosh, I wonder what's going on with that at the moment.
The key thing at the moment that is occupying a lot of my thought is is trying to establish. So I kind of mentioned the stuff around sex dolls earlier. So some of your viewers might not. I don't know. Maybe might not like hearing about this topic because it's quite difficult to talk about. It's quite controversial, I guess. But it's really important because we are currently seeing really fast-moving policy discussions about this. So essentially, in the UK, in the US, there's moves to in Australia as well. Actually, there's moves at the moment to try to ban what are essentially silicon sex toys. So in the form of human bodies. So typically what we're talking about are female-looking dolls that are marketed to heterosexual men. There are other models, but that's the bulk of the market. The vast majority of discussions seem to be focused around the idea of objectification and potential risk in terms of future sexual offending. But again, there's no data to support that. We've done some preliminary work looking at just people who own sex dolls and people who don't, those two groups, and we've compared them on different measures of risk of proclivity for sexual offending. So that is basically you give people a range of scenarios and you say, in this situation, how aroused would you be? Would you do the same? Would you enjoy getting your way? And you average those scores to get an index of their interest in that kind of behavior. So that gives us a proclivity score. We've looked at things like personality traits, we've looked at attachment styles, we've looked at emotional expression, we've looked at sexual self-esteem, we've looked at preoccupation, and we're essentially finding very few differences between people who own sex dolls and people who don't. So on the basis of our data, they are correlational data, they are cross-sectional data, so we can't say that sex dolls are causing or affecting anything, but what we can say is that there's no difference between those groups as the data currently stand. Now, if it was the case that sex dolls were risk enhancing, then we would see a difference, because those with sex dolls would score higher on those risk measures. We can't say that if they scored lower, the dolls are reducing their risk, but we could say that there is a plausible argument if there was a higher score that would be risk enhancing. Now, what we're not finding in our data is that relationship. So we can kind of half dispense, I guess, with the idea that those dolls are risk enhancing. Now, for me, that's really interesting because we've got these essentially advanced sex toys that people are owning and using. It doesn't seem, from the data that we've got at the moment, and this is obviously very preliminary data still, it doesn't seem like there's an association with risk. So if that's the case, why are we discussing criminalization of owning something that causes no harm in the vast majority of people that own them? And for me, it's about that emotional response that we have to it. We just don't like them in the same way that we maybe don't like other things in society, and then we try to ban those things as well. So for me, it's about thinking through what are the relationships between sex doll ownership and risk or well-being maybe, and can we start to formulate a profile of who these people are that own sex dolls? Can we identify if, under certain circumstances, they are harmful? If they are, then maybe we can think about regulation. But if they're not harmful, then how do we have a sensible social discussion about the fact that some people just don't want to have relationships with other people, and they might be happy having sexual interactions with their doll? So the key thing that is really, just to go back to your question, I guess, what's kind of grabbing my attention at the minute, we're trying to set up a study that is more longitudinal. So thinking about people who buy their first doll and then following them up. Because obviously it might be that people who own sex dolls at the moment, in our cross-sectional work, maybe their behaviours and attitudes have developed over time. Maybe they've bought their dolls because of those attitudes. We just don't know, because of the nature of those studies. So if we can start a longitudinal study where you get people, when they buy their first doll, You can collect baseline data then of the type of people who buy dolls for the first time, and then over the case of the first year, maybe you can start to track whether there are changes in attitudes, behaviors. If there are, then we can think about what that means. If there aren't, then again we can think about whether we are actually having a sensible discussion about these things. And obviously there are other issues as well that I'm still developing my thinking about in terms of the prevention of sexual offending, particularly around the prevention of sexual offending against children, because we can't be naive and just think that these are adult-looking dolls. There are also childlike dolls that are available, which is a slightly separate issue. And my thinking's still developing on that, so I'm probably not going to go into too much detail about that. But over time, I think that will be a discussion that society needs to have about what role do these essentially sex toys have in the prevention of sexual harm, but also in the treatment of people with sexual dysfunction. It might be that people who are, so men, for example, who are younger, if they're experiencing erectile dysfunction, typically that's related to some sort of psychological issue rather than a physiological issue. So is there a role for sex toys, for sex dolls, for sex robots in the treatment of erectile dysfunction in men that don't have physiologically caused erectile dysfunction? There may be, and there's other kind of treatments that other ways that we can use these sort of dolls. People have been using them in care homes, for example, for older people who are experiencing loneliness, to give them something that they can kind of attach to have that kind of intimate bond with something, particularly when the AI is developing so much. But these are all kind of in the future kind of studies. I think immediately we just need more data. We need to know what the effects are, if there are any effects of these dolls, and then we can start to frame our social discussions around data rather than our kind of gut feelings about what these dolls represent. Yeah, that's a rambling answer to your question.
No, it's not. It's actually very cogent, and I think there are a couple of things I'd pick out. First of all, one of the things that we don't know, I'm generalizing myself, but one of the things that I have always found there is a tendency to do is sort of create theories on the basis of fear rather than evidence. And so the theories will come from that fear in this particular situation of objectification leading to a sort of desensitization of the potential subject, i.e. women in this particular case. And therefore, if you're desensitized to the individual as a person, as a real person, you're equating to them a doll, then that theory is that you're more likely then to go on and commit offences. And even as you explain it, you can see how some aspects of that would be tenuous, but nevertheless, it's not evidence-based either way. So, I could make accusations of that, but I would need data to back me up, which is what you're doing. But I don't think that many people realize that that's what theories are. It always made me smile in my early days and my masters when we would talk about what's the theory, and I always, when I first heard the word theory, I was thinking of these grandiose sort of theory of relativity and what we need to do. And really, these theories are everywhere. They're small, large, medium. They take place all the time. They snap. The theory is just a shorthand for what do you think might happen. So it's sort of that really interests me, and I maybe goes back to your interest in research methods. But then, what you're talking about, that sort of that fear response, that it comes from a prejudicial response, and remembering that prejudicial responses are based on schema, which are not necessarily a bad thing. So it's interesting to sort of take that discussion through its take that research, through its paces, and actually find at the end of it something that hopefully allows some objectivity to the discussion. So no, more power to you for actually doing something which is so challenging, because I can see why you would be challenged and understand why that would happen, and yet pushing through it and trying to find answers to questions which for some people are really meaningful. So absolutely. So thank you. Okay, so in talking about that, you've also talked about what excites you for your future in psychology. So you've talked about your longitudinal study, but if I forced you to look even further ahead, is there something else that sort of, in 10, 15 years time, you're thinking, oh my goodness, I need to get to that next? Is there anything else that's burning out there?
In terms of academia, I'm very much, I feel at the moment like I'm in a bit of a transition period. So just recently I got a promotion from senior lecturer to associate professor. So I'm kind of in that transition period, I guess, from more teaching focused to more research focused is my understanding of that transition. I'm only kind of 3 or 4 months, 3 or 4 months into that. So I'm trying to get used to that new role. I think over time, what I'll see is that I'm focusing more on how can I take the research that we're doing and translate that into some kind of impact. Now I realise that impact is a bit of a buzzword in higher education, but basically, how can we use data that we're collecting and change attitudes, change policy, affect people who are making decisions? Because what I would really love to see, and this is probably something that is, I say probably, it's definitely something that's beyond my individual skill set, but collectively as a psychological discipline, if we can convince particularly policymakers to see past the next election cycle. So I think that's the biggest issue that we have in terms of evidence-based policy. Thinking about the fact that we know that politicians want to get elected at the next vote. So if that's the case, how can we kind of manage that desire from them while still getting them to think about the longer term decisions, the longer term effects of the decisions that they're making? So particularly around the prevention of sexual harm, this isn't something that is going to be fixable in a single election cycle or 2 election cycles. If you set up a service that is for people in the community who are experiencing potentially harmful, and I say potentially because there are people who experience certain sexual interests that will never harm, which is another, I guess, uncomfortable belief, but it is completely borne out in the evidence, in the interviews that we're doing, in the data that we're collecting. But if you can set up a service for these individuals that may be struggling with certain sexual attractions or romantic attractions, to evaluate that kind of service takes much longer than 3, 4 or 5 years because of the number of people that will come forward immediately and kind of the trickling of people coming forward. So you need to take that longer term view of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years before you fully know whether that's working, because you just need the data to evaluate. But getting people to think long term like that about difficult conversations that most people have an instinctive what's the word, hatred for, an instinctive aversion to, is so difficult. So we did one study actually. There's the final study of my PhD. This is one thing that I'm really excited about actually. If we can get this off the ground, then I think this would be the proudest moment of my career. So I did a study that was looking at attitudes towards people with paedophilic sexual interests. So difficult topic again. But what we know is that people who have these sexual attractions often don't come forward because of the stigma that they face. And that's not me saying, so something that quite often this field gets misunderstood for is that we basically say, well, stigma causes people to cause harm, which isn't the case. Stigma stops people coming forward for support, and people who don't have support are more likely, if they have certain psychological traits, to cause harm. So it's the lack of support that's the issue, not the stigma necessarily. But to get people to access support, you need to break down stigma. So what we've done is we've looked at different ways that we can start to maybe break down some of that stigma. So I coined a phrase called narrative humanization in my PhD. So we have this instinctive view of people who are paedophilic as this kind of monster stereotype. If you look at any kind of tabloid headlines, it's all monster, beast, fiend, about this kind of group. So what we did was we had 2 different video conditions. There was one where it was someone who was paedophilic talking about his sexual attractions, talking about the fact there was no support, because there isn't support typically in the community until someone commits an offence, which is a huge issue. We had a separate condition, which was a professor talking about his research into paedophilia. Both of them were essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But the source of the information was different.
Yeah.
So in that narrative humanization condition, where it's someone talking about their first person experiences of this attraction, what we found was that there was a significant reduction in stigmatization scores. So perceptions of dangerousness, perceptions of whether people choose this attraction, perceptions of deviance. We've since done a funded project that was looking at that more longitudinally. So the first study was student sample. Second study was about 900 community members, looking at pre and post watching the same videos, but then also following them up at 4 months. And we see that those effects at 4 months are smaller because of just time diminishes those effects, but they're still there. There's still significant differences compared to pre-watching the video. So going to my kind of blue sky idea, I guess, is if we can take this kind of idea of narrative humanization, get people actually talking about people who have different potentially offence-related sexual interests, if that's the way that we want to frame it. Is there scope maybe to write in a character into a soap that has sexual attractions to children? So they start experiencing sexual attractions, they experience the same levels of psychological distress associated with that. Most people who have these interests or attractions do experience things like shame, depression, anxiety. There's very high levels of suicidal ideation. If we can write a character into a soap like that, we've seen the effects that that kind of mechanism, that kind of social vehicle can have on access for domestic abuse services, to addressing racism, to looking at breaking down stereotypes and stigma about other marginalised groups. So if we can have this kind of mass societal intervention, I guess, in terms of how people view this attraction style, how people view the process of preventing sexual harm, then I think that probably, if we could get something off the ground, that would absolutely be my proudest moment in academia, because I think doing something at that scale that has such a potential to change attitudes and the way that we view sexual abuse prevention in the UK and potentially internationally would be massive. Because I think actually if people actually were exposed to the messages that are coming from these individuals, rather than just buying into the stereotype of this person is essentially this kind of pervert over here who is deviant, is a monster, who's going to hurt people. If people actually communicate with people who have these sexual attractions, they get a very different view. They would get a very different view very quickly about what it's like to live with that kind of sexual attraction, what it's like to live with not being able to be open. So a lot of this work's been led by a colleague of mine. So yeah, this is, for me, that would be kind of ultimately, that would be a huge thing in my career if we could do that. I've spoken to a few people about whether it's possible. Commissioners probably aren't going to go for it, but we can keep knocking on the door.
I think, you know, I can see an immediate allegory, which is the development of attitudes towards mental health. So, and if you, again, were to sort of talk 20, 30 years ago about schizophrenia, for instance, and at that particular point, as soon as you mentioned it, it would be connotated with dual personality syndrome and other, you know, and then extreme violence and those kind of immediate correlations made in individuals' minds. And unfortunately, that was stigmatizing. So it meant that anybody who was experiencing those kinds of phenomena in their own mental health would not go forward, or would less likely to go forward to get treatment. And yet treatment is out there, and treatment is available, and treatment is highly successful in allowing individuals to live normal lives. So in that particular instance, immediately you can see that were it to be, were treatment, were support to be available, then it could help people live lives which did not cause harm, did not cause the kind of outcome which people clearly fear when they hear the term paedophilia or paedophile. And so that means that I can certainly see the benefits, but I would say we're at that point. We're a long way away from it, because there would be, I certainly, from my perspective, and that is just my perspective, I can't imagine it happening right now, due to the outrage and reaction that would likely happen due to lack of understanding. But there you go. It's a sort of cart before the horse situation. You don't know. You're going to have to do one in order to move it forward. So all power to you, Craig. Good luck. I will follow with interest.
I think we will need that luck.
I just want to ask, if you wouldn't mind, if you could talk about your the community that you're trying to build through iProgress for a second. And what I'm really interested in hearing is to, you know, first of all, why and what you're hoping for, and then I guess you know, where do you see it going in the next year or two?
Sure, yeah. So for people who maybe aren't aware, so iProgress is an online community that I formed with Dr. Dean Fido. So we have a Discord server that people can join for free. We've got a YouTube channel, we've got various social portals as well, so you can find us on Twitter. And what we're trying to do with this is to have a kind of a shared space where people can look at the difficulties that they're experiencing in academia, in higher education as part of their university degrees, to share best practices, but also for us to be able to kind of pass on a little bit of our own experience. So we've got a podcast that looks at various different parts of higher education. We've recently been looking at things like mental health. We've looked at why people maybe are leaving academia. We've been very focused recently on kind of people doing their PhDs, because I think at the moment there's a lot of discussion about the various virtues and vices, I guess, of academia, what's good about it, what's maybe not so good about it. So we've been trying to look at that, but we're also really interested in things like productivity. We know that students, and this comes from, I guess this comes from a little bit of frustration on our part, in that we work every day with students who really want to achieve. They really do, and they're not taught from an early age how to work. There's an emphasis on learning for exams or learning for coursework, but there's nothing in terms of how do you structure your day, how do you structure your work, how do you get the most out of your time? Because ultimately these people are coming to university, they are obviously coming for a degree, but they're also coming for the experience. You kind of alluded to this earlier, in that people go to university, it might be the first time that they're living away from home, they're forming new friendships, new relationships, they want to go out, they want to go to clubs, they want to go to bars. But because people typically don't know how to work, that behaviour comes at the detriment of their course. So you have people who have gone through their A levels, maybe, so this is very kind of UK centric, I guess, if we're talking about A levels. They've gone through their A levels, getting A's and B's, and then they get to university and they're getting a 2-2, which would be, I don't know, a C or a low C maybe in the States. And it comes as a complete shock to them. And then you get that kind of compounding effect of lower grades, poorer motivation, poorer mental health, lower grades, poorer motivation, and it spirals over time. So what we would like to do really is to help people to think about how they're working. So we've got a course on our website, so people who join the community can get either free or paid access to various courses that we've produced, or various kind of resources that we've got on our website. The one that we released first was about getting started at university. So people right at the beginning of their university career, how do you set up the workflows? How do you set up the mindset? How do you think about different class types? So most people don't know what the difference is between a lecture and a seminar, for example. And why would they? They've never been in these different classes. What's the difference between a seminar and a tutorial? It's not obvious when you just look at the size of the class or the layout of the classroom. So what we've tried to do is to put together various different resources that will hopefully help people get ahead a little bit, maybe change their mindset a little bit, while enjoying their university course and enjoying the university experience, because it's really important that you do that. You're not going to get those 3 years again to do it. I wish I could go back and do that more, but you don't get those 3 years back. So make sure you are enjoying the university experience, but when you're at university, when you're on campus, making sure you're working deeply, working effectively, so that when you are out at the club or at the bar, you're not thinking, I've got a deadline in 2 days' time, I'm going to have to pull an all-nighter tomorrow. Because if you can set the workflows up, if you can work, I don't know, 3 hours deeply on an essay in the daytime, that's as good as working for 7 or 8 hours in a distracted format where you've got multiple tabs open when you're on TikTok, when you're on Facebook. If you can just work in a focused way, and we try and do that, we're trying to have these conversations through the iProgress community. So I mentioned that there are different plans that people can join. There's a free plan, which means you get access to the Discord, you get access to the podcast, you get access to kind of shorter versions of our educational resources. If you are a paying member, then you get all of that. You get access to the full courses. Depending on the tier that you're paying, you can suggest podcast episodes, you get early access to things. We do a monthly or quarterly AMA type session, so Ask Me Anything type session, so you can literally just rock up and ask us anything you want, once a quarter or once a month if you're a paying member. At the moment as well, what we've got is, because it's a new kind of enterprise, any paying plan at the moment is just £2.99 a month, so £2.99 a month. That's for 6 months, just so that we can kind of, what we don't want to do is to rip people off, basically. So when we are setting up, when we're putting out these new courses, what we don't want people to be doing is pay the £4, £8, £12 that will eventually be our different tiers, when actually that material isn't up on the site as yet. There's still material there, there's still value there, but the material will grow over time. So as a kind of thank you to people who are joining the community early as paying members, you can get this kind of founders plan at the moment, which is just £2.99 a month for the next 3 months.
Very good. No, that sounds great. I mean, I 100% agree with the fact that if you are able to enjoy your studies, then everything else will flow much more easily. So anything that will support that will help. And the second thing would be that I know that for myself, and I know for others, that a structure in your working life helps. And this is almost being able to make that equivalent in your studying, in your academic life, is something that would be incredibly powerful. And I know that looking back at my own approach to my master's, that's how I did it. I structured it, and so that was how I was able to actually get the work done on time, which was massively different to my undergraduate career. So if I knew then what I know now, and that's what you're trying to do, you're trying to distill it and support people, then yes, £2.99 would be cheap. And I'm sure that the tiers will make all the sense in the world. So thank you for that. And I just want to end up just by asking, is there anything else that you would want to tell any students listening that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing, I guess, for me, everything that I talk about will start and end with the concept of workflow. So making sure that you have a really clear workflow for what you're doing. Set up with your email inbox, set up folders for your email inbox, be organized, because the more you can be structured, the more you can be organized, the easier it is to get into that deep work mindset, that deep work state, that state of flow that people will learn about if they are psychology undergraduates. So we have got a few resources actually that might be useful for that. There's a template that we've got for a program called Notion, which is completely free. You can get access to Notion for completely nothing. If you sign up with a university email address as well, you get unlimited storage on Notion as well, which is great. What we've done is we've set up different planners on Notion. So these are available for purchase through our website. Maybe we can put some links in the description for this as well. So there's a full academic planner, which will help you plan all of your time, all of your assessments. It'll help you track all of your modules, but then you can, if you've got a different way of organizing that, then you could just get hold of the module planner, which will help you organize your notes. If you're just looking for a template for how to make notes in a lecture, there's one of those available as well. But the key thing for me that I really find useful, I do this in all of my writing as well, is that I never start a project, never start a document that is completely blank. I always have a template. So whether it's a paper that I'm writing, whether it's some meeting notes that I'm making, whether it's a spreadsheet that I need to format, I've always got a template that I'm starting from. Because if you've got that blank sheet of paper in front of you, it can be so overwhelming just to start. And I think with lecture notes, for example, if you've got a blank sheet of paper in front of you, it's so tempting to just write down everything the lecture says in the session. And actually, if you think about modern universities, you've probably got access to the slides before the session. You've probably got a recording of that lecture as well. So why are you writing down everything that the lecturer is saying? There's no need for you to do that. If you can follow the structure of that lecture, follow the story of that lecture, make a note of key things that maybe you didn't grasp in the session, so then you know what to go back to. That's a much more efficient use of that lecture time as well. If you're just going to go to a lecture and write down everything that you hear, for me, and I tell this to my students as well, you may as well not be there, because you are essentially wasting that hour or that 2 hours, because you're going to have to go back anyway to watch it afterwards. So you may as well be doing something else. So yeah, these templates that we've set up hopefully are designed to allow people to make notes and to structure their courses, their modules, and their academic lives in a much more systematic way.
That sounds great, and definitely we'll put some links into that. Yeah, I definitely can. I certainly resonate when you talk about the fear of the white page, because I've felt that a number of times, and I really I agree 100% with the point you're making. I have tried to take down verbatim what a lecturer is saying, and not only did I not manage, but nor did I listen or hear anything the lecturer had actually said, and so I had to go back and watch again. And so you're absolutely right that it's a great tip. Well, listen, that's all we have for today. So thank you so much, Dr. Craig Harper, for coming on and sharing both your academic, your research, and also the development of iProgress with us.
It's been great. Thanks very much for having me.